Hello, once again. This is Bob, Dennis, and Aaron Coffey having another random discussion on topics related to micropulse and PMF and health in general and the philosophy of things. So I'm going to ask Aaron what he's got on his mind today.
All right, so we took a quick break and just thought you might want to know that basically everything that we do is unrehearsed. That's why it's so not polished. It's unpolished.
Yeah, unedited. Well, Aaron, full disclosure, occasionally Aaron will send me an email and say, would you be willing to talk about this or that? And usually I respond with, yeah, sure.
Yeah, usually he says, yeah, you should wait till we do the video to ask me. And I was like, okay, but in the break, I wanted to ask him just to see, is this going to be something we can talk about in the time frame that we have? Not, is this something that, we're going to rehearse and talk about later? So I sent him an email 5 minutes before the video started to ask, hey, what do you know about this? So here's my question. I want to read it off of this thing here, and I've started a timer so I don't talk for 2 hours. The question is, when you look at the literature that you have posted for M1 and the B5C5, the different units, you have a chart with the actual breakdown of the pulsations. So like 100 pulses, 10 pulses, whatever, different types of things. And so what does minus 100 versus plus 100 mean? Is this referring to electrical polarity, as in electrons versus protons, or is this referring to magnetic poles?
The brief answer is it's referring to magnetic poles, because I'm running the current one direction through from the perspective of the biological recipient, it's a magnetic pole, okay? So what it really means is, which direction am I running the current through the ICES coils? So if I run it in one direction, then the coil's like a solenoid. One end of the coil will be north and the other end will be south. When I run the current the other way, it'll reverse. It'll be south and north instead of north and south. And so I'm really just reversing the magnetic poles, right? So what is the biological effect? There may be many effects, but the one that I'm getting after is based upon, I had done a huge amount of research years and years ago, and you can see this in the medical literature. I'd done a fair amount of research, only published a tiny amount of it, but on implantable electrical stimulators like pacemakers and muscle stimulators and stuff. And one of the things you discover very, very soon is that if you have a net electric charge moving one way or the other, it actually causes tissue damage, and it actually damages the electrode, believe it or not. And one of the best ways to keep an implantable stimulator, nice and clean and shiny and not damage tissue is to fully reverse the pulses. So in the field of muscle physiology, the scientific literature on this, we call that bipolar pulsing. And devices are actually designed so that if you take an integral, it's a calculus thing, you take the total amount of current that you're forcing in one direction, then what you do is you reverse it exactly so that you're putting exactly the same amount of current going in the other direction. And in the end, you have zero net. It's sort of like running the length of a football field and running back and running back and running back to where you started. You can do that 1,000 times, but your net movement is zero, right? Because you've moved no actual distance that's permanent. You've just, but if you look at it in an instant of time, you've got quite a lot of net movement, right? So I'm reversing the magnetic fields because what I'm attempting to do is to move ions intracellularly and in the extracellular space. I'm attempting to move them along membranes to simulate motion and to simulate exercise and normal activities in healthy tissue. And to avoid any kind of problems, I'm trying to move them and then move them back. And it's more like to simulate walking or exercise, where you move, you squeeze tissues, you move them, fluid moves one way, then it moves back, it moves one way, then it moves back. And so all of the protocols on the micropulse systems do that automatically unless I state otherwise. So if you don't see a plus or a minus, what it means is it's automatically bipolar. One pulse positive, one pulse negative, one pulse positive, one pulse negative, where positive and negative refer to magnetic polarity. But if you see a plus or a minus sign in front of it, that means it's unidirectional. And so I do have a few protocols that have unidirectional pulsing. And so I just say plus or minus. But is it absolutely plus or minus? Well, you would have to actually, it depends on how you place the coils. It's going to go one way or it'll go the other.
That makes sense. So basically, if my M1 unit says 5 pulses per second or 10 pulses per second, is that going to be positive, negative? I mean, north, south, north, south, north, south, north, south for 10 per second? Or is that going to
It'll go, north, then south, then north, then south, then north. That's 5 pulses. That's what I'm calling 5 pulses. And it's, that's what you get. Yeah.
Is that the same, just out of curiosity, I don't know a lot about electricity, certainly not the degree that an engineer would. So when someone would use other language, 5 hertz or something like that, 5 cycles per second, whatever, is that the same type of thing? Or is
in common usage, it's very similar. So, because I'm viewing it differently. I'm viewing these different transformations. And I talk a lot about this on my long and ponderous videos, right? Because it's very easy to ask a simple question, like my 5-year-old daughter might ask. She's 8 now, but when she's 5, why is the sky blue? And then you go, okay, well, let me explain electromagnetic scattering to you, and blah blah blah, right? You got to talk about the radius of a dinitrogen atoms and stuff like that. So it's easy to ask simple questions, and the answers are kind of complicated, and it gets that way very quickly when you start talking about PEMF. Because it's a very reasonable question, because everybody wants to know, well, what hertz should I use? Well, to a modern person who uses computers, or in modern use, the word hertz means cycles per second. Like how many times does it turn on and off in a second, or go positive and negative in a second. To an electrical engineer or a signal processing person, hertz means frequency means a different thing than it does to an average person. If you're getting a PhD in, electrical engineering or signal processing, and somebody asks you, well, what is frequency? The answer is that it's the first time derivative of phase, which phase is like, where is it along the sinusoid that it's going on. And if you take the first time derivative, it tells you how many of those you get in a certain period of time, usually 1 second. Sometimes, and the units that people like to use for analysis are actually radians per second, not cycles per second. So the thing is that, I'm thinking more like a signal processing person and an electrical engineer, and most people are thinking, well, how many pulses per second? Now this gets even more complicated, because if I give you a single pulse, right, just a single electrical pulse through the solenoid, it actually results in one magnetic pulse, right? But the magnetic pulse then will follow the pulse like that, and it has a rising edge and a falling edge, and the induced electrical pulse on the other end of the biological system will actually have, the receiving system will actually see the rise in the magnetic field, and it will respond with one type of electrical flow. Then it'll see a fall in the same pulse, and it will respond with the opposite electrical flow. So you're actually kind of getting, for a single pulse, like a half of a wave, you're actually getting sort of 2 electrical fields generated. So I think it's very difficult to say, because, it's got to be kind of clearly defined. And that's why I sort of say pulses per second instead of hertz, because it gets even more complicated when you start to actually do like Fourier transforms. Like you could say, what frequency is 1 pulse per second? Well, it depends entirely on how sharp that is, because unless it's a pure sinusoid, which is 1 frequency, it's 1 hertz. If it's a square wave, you actually get 1 hertz, and then you get all these these harmonics after it, because it rings. It's like being slammed up and then slammed down, so that higher and higher and higher frequencies. So a square wave is actually made of a series of of individual frequencies that are all added together. And all of these frequencies have energy in them, a certain amount. It tends to die off as you go up. So the simple question is pulses per second, the same as Hertz, or is that frequency? It's kind of complicated, and making it even more complicated, we don't know necessarily how this interacts with biology. So, everybody always asks me this, and I've made many, many videos about it. The answer is, I don't think there's a simple answer for it. I mean, technically, trying to use the language that people normally speak, if they're not like geeky kind of electrical engineer types like I am, biophysics types people, it's really hard to describe, because it's, square waves don't have just one frequency, and one frequency of an input does not equal necessarily one same frequency of an output.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you, because I'm not an electrical engineer or a biophysicist, and as much as I like to dabble, that's not my desire in life to become one either. So for all the people out there that don't have that formal background, I like to ask questions periodically. One that I want to know about, and two, because I'd like to try to help repackage it for people that who might also be as confused as I am, but just slightly curious as to how it works, but without the engineering level depth. And at both ends, basically what I'm saying is it's so complicated that there's layers upon layers upon layers of different.
Right. Well, I'm not trying to. I made up a special word for this. Okay. I'm trying to bring it into common uses. It's called complexificate. So when you complexificate something, it's like you're making something way more complex than it needs to be. And the word is complexification. It's more complex than it needs to be. And the idea is that I'm not trying to complexificate the issue of electromagnetism. The fact is there are many people who are like seniors in college in physics who fail an electromagnetism course because it's so immensely, fiendishly complex. And a lot of times, people just like normal people like me have trouble doing the math. And it's so immensely complex. And so, does it matter? Yes. Because if you don't do the math right, you can't make a radio. You couldn't make a GPS. None of these things would work. You have to do the math just to make modern computers. When you're talking about frequencies, they're sending square waves, right?
Yeah.
So I actually know pretty well. I know some people who did the design on this. How does a computer send these gigahertz frequencies through the motherboard on a computer? Well, it turns out it's all about the math. And it's all about the harmonics and the reflections of frequencies and exactly where you put things in them. And it's so immensely complex that regular numbers don't even suffice. You have to actually use imaginary numbers to be able to start to describe it. You can't. It's in a dimension that actually literally is called imaginary. So you have to imagine that it's there. And these are imaginary numbers. When you solve them, you can come out with real numbers, but then there's imaginary numbers. And because computers are real devices, they have to work. We're both using one right now. But you try to put square waves that are very high frequency through these things. How do you get control of the ringing and the banging and the resonances and stuff? And it turns out you have to place into the design of these integrated circuits and these boards actually imaginary resistances and negative resistances and things that actually will suck the imaginary energy out of these imaginary waveforms, because the imaginary mathematics tells you it's there. And if you don't do all of these imaginary things and do them correctly, it doesn't work. And the mathematics of that is beyond what I can comprehend after having studied it for 20 years. So I feel pretty good about telling people this stuff is really complicated, because there's limits to what I can understand. And I mean, this is what I do. And it's some of it's beyond anything I can do. And I have to talk to experts, and they have to try to simplify it for me, and so that I can get it. And
so it really is incredibly complicated.
It is incredibly complicated, but in the end, mathematically, some of this stuff is solvable. And somebody might say, well, Bob's just making a big deal out of square waves. They're just square waves, and you just count them. How many do you have in a second? Yeah, sure, you can do that too. Now, I think that what's happened is that when people make PEMF devices to sell, until I started making these, people liked to charge $20 or $30 or $40,000 for a PEMF device. Until I came into the market and said, well, they're really not that complicated, guys. You can make them smaller and cheaper and safer and stuff like that. But in order to sell them for that much money, you've got to have some scientific credibility. So people start using, Gauss and frequency and stuff, and they use those words in a way that, as a scientist, I have a problem with it, because they're not using them with the kind of scientific precision that allows them to actually say anything and mean anything. But what they generally mean, I mean, you can always take all of my arguments and all of my sentiments about this and sort of throw them in the trash can and say, okay, man, all we care about is how many pulses per second. And we can talk about that too. And what I'm saying is that when you're looking at just pulses per second, you're missing a huge amount of information. Much of it actually is projected into this imaginary space mathematically. Much of it has biological relevance that we just do not understand. So when people try to sort of sort out like which frequency, treats or cures this disease, all I can think of is, well, gosh, it's a lot more complicated than that, because the exact shape of when you say square wave, there is no such thing as a square wave. All square waves are actually trapezoidal. They're all, they've all got sloping edges because a voltage can't change from 0 to something. It's got to, it's got to change it's got to transition to that. Same thing with magnetic fields. So they're never instantaneous. It's always happening over some amount of time. And so how quickly that happens tells you something about the actual extra frequencies that are ringing at higher and higher levels. And do those have an effect? I think so, because if you put like say you do a 10 hertz sine wave, PEMF has very different effects that you will see clinically than a 10 hertz square wave.
Interesting.
Very different. And I just said there's no such thing as a square wave. And I use a square wave because it just simplifies it. So I don't have to say, well, it's a trapezoidal wave and it has these kinds of properties and stuff like that. But those details really matter. If you didn't do that level of detail, you could never make a radio work or a GPS or anything like that, like I said before. And yet people who use them, they dial in a frequency, and they say, I'm listening to this frequency. So to use it, you got to simplify it.
So it's really, otherwise, factors are like, you've got using English only and not math. You have English language only and not math. You have the world of magnetism and all the parameters that magnetism brings to the table. The world of electricity and all the parameters that electricity brings to the table. And the world of sound and all of the things that sound brings to the table. On top of all of that, you've got just a greater level of complexity. When I think a lot of the average Joe people, when they're thinking of pulses per second and so forth, I think it relates more towards the idea of music. The idea if that I hit a note and just let it ring, then that's going to be therapeutic. And I think that a lot of people that are asking the micropulse questions, they're looking at it from the most understandable of all those worlds. They've gone from sound and magnetism and electricity in their mind. And so they're saying, well, if you just get it to that right sound and we just turn it on and press the key on the piano and it resonates out in my body, is that what's causing me to feel better? But you're saying it's way more complicated than just hitting a note on the piano and then electronically inducing that into your body via magnet.
Well, what I guess I'm saying is it's way more complicated, but it's also, in a sense, it's way more simple than that, right? It's like, does it make you feel better? Does it actually make you healthier? And if it does, that's great. And here's the thing, we don't necessarily understand it. And what I think you see a lot in the market and a lot on the internet is people saying, well, I have a secret frequency, or I have a secret, you can buy my my secret diet supplement or whatever. And a lot of people sort of keep secrets because, maybe because their secret's not really such a big secret. I mean, there are drug companies that sell these secret, wonderful new, treatments for, drugs for the example I can think of is they did one for breast cancer, and all it was vitamin D3. That was it. Boom. And they had some kind of complexificated name for it and all kinds of other stuff. But I think it was 2 different companies branded it differently. And it was just vitamin D. And they didn't tell people, you know, you don't have to pay $53, you know, for a gel cap of this. You can actually buy the same thing, probably better quality on Amazon for, you know, $12 or something for hundreds of them. But, you know, and you see the same thing, I think, a lot in PEMF and everything. So people try to make it mysterious. I'm not trying to make it mysterious. I'm just saying, because making it mysterious means, well, they know something really deep and everything, and they're just not going to tell you. Whereas I tell people everything I know, which is oftentimes not much, right? And this is the thing. So I've had arguments with people about this, and people have actually gotten physically violent. And they're saying, you know, tell me the secret frequency, and I just can't, because I don't think there is one. I think the big secret in PEMF that I'm working on has to do with the waveform and how that shape magnetically induces an electric field deep in your body. That's what I think is going on. And I think that the math of that is easy enough that I keep pointing people to Wikipedia and other sources and saying, well, if you take the slope of this, it tells you the number you need to know. And that's really my understanding of it. It's pretty simple, actually. As soon as you start doing a lot of math, analysis, you're starting to make a lot of assumptions that aren't necessarily true either. Because these trapezoidal waves aren't, I say they're not even perfectly square, but they're not really trapezoidal either. They're kind of, like you pointed out, they're sort of sigmoidal. They start to pick up and then they kind of get a little bit straight. Sigmoidal means S-shaped. So the sides of a trapezoid are not a trapezoidal pulse are not really trapezoidal. You can look at them on an oscilloscope. They're actually curved. And they go and they start to rise at a maximum rate, and then they start to roll off and they level off. So there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more.
With the top chopped off or something.
It is just like that, and it's you know, as an engineer, I tend to think of it as, well, there's a low pass filter, so only certain high frequencies can make it through, because the rest of your practical circuit prevents these super high frequencies from existing. And the super high frequencies, when they're gone, they tend to round the corners on square things, because square changes tend to have very high frequencies associated with them. And if you round those off, you can get rid of a lot of those high frequencies. And so, you know, it really does come down to, it's like tuning a piano, right? And the harmonics and the timbre of music. And I think these things matter. They really do. And on the other hand, we don't necessarily understand them. And many people don't understand how to reproduce them. Have you ever heard a Stradivarius, a violin?
Yes.
They sound different. They sound better. They're deeper and they're richer and they're better. And that's why if you want to own a Stradivarius, you got to write a big check. It's like 7 digits before the decimal, right? And how do they work? We don't know. And they can't really, as far as I know, they can't really reproduce a Stradivarius. They don't know. And people try all kinds of things, taking apples and plums and fermenting them in the water and then soaking the wood and all kinds of things like that. And, the formic acid from the fermentation affects the structure of the wood. And, you can get into all of these things, right? And at some level, all of that's really, really, really important if you want to make a Stradivarius. But if you're not trying to make one, if you're just trying to enjoy it, you just simply need to listen and you can hear the difference, right? And I think this is the case with PEMF. I don't think it's fully understood. Most people can't replicate it quite right. But on the other hand, even a cheap violin like my kids are going to have in middle school, a $25 violin, it still makes music, right? And so this is the way I look at PEMF. Virtually all PEMF seems to work. It's just, how do you refine it down to the Stradivarius and make it work really, really well? But then you can sell the Stradivarius for a very reasonable amount. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. And a lot of PEMF systems are just kind of like, it's just a frequency, whatever. Just put in 10 pulses per second. And it turns out that that's really not, it's really not what's going on. It's more complicated than that. And yet it's more simple than that when you're looking at it from the perspective of a user.
Well, that's why I had to ask, because I think your viewers, if they're most of your viewers are probably fans, it's always likely to say that maybe some of your viewers are competitors who buy your product, but that's just
yeah.
But that's kind of within the industry. But I'd say the vast majority of your viewers, myself included, are people that we bought it because we saw your videos, we read your material, we saw how open you are to being honest about things, and you're not like, you're not out there snake oil selling us something that looks like from the 1980s and it cost $10,000, and none of us could afford it anyway, even if that was the case. So I think that's why you have so many people that genuinely like your channel and like the forum. And I'm speaking for all of them because everyone that I've spoken to has felt the same way. And they've all, nobody wants to go out there and have to buy from a medical distributor who's got all these great claims. And even if they do have a lot of data, I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. I don't want to go out to the website, and I go out on the web every day and look for stuff related to PEMF just to see what's out there, certainly a couple times a week. And most of what I find, I've never found anything more affordable than MicroPulse. And like I said before, I don't make a dime. It's just my personal opinion, not an affiliate. I just say what I think. And so I found one last week. It was $1,000. I'm not going to mention what it was or where it came from. But it was $1,000, and it looks like a knockoff of one of yours from several years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to another friend of mine out west, and he said he was injured last year, and a friend of his owned one of these types of devices, generally speaking, a PEMF device. It was $20,000 that this doctor had to pay to get one to help his patients. He didn't know of anything cheaper, I presume. So he just got what he thought was out there, and he's been helping people. My friend was genuinely helped by it, but I was thinking, man, imagine if he had, if either other people had bought one of these devices themselves, or if they're not comfortable, if he'd at least bought one and then helped them learn how to use it. I don't think it would have eaten into his margin to the degree that he would have lost every patient that he had. I think everybody that he knows and more would be coming to him. That's my theory.
Well, I think you've got some good insights there, and I do appreciate your sentiment on this. I think most people who are willing to try what I'm doing sort of see what I'm doing, which is I'm just trying to tell the truth. And there's a lot of things I don't know, and there's a lot of things where I was just wrong to begin with. Like I thought, started off, it's well known now for anybody who's watched anything I've said. I thought PEMF was nonsense until I discovered that it really helped to correct these problems I was having with my back. And I had to sort of, this was 15 years ago, really, that I started discovering this kind of thing. I think it was 2004, 2005. And it was, and before that with NASA, well, there was really an effect. I had to accept that, but I didn't think it was really something that would matter on a large scale clinically. I thought it was more sort of cellular effects, but based on the NASA data. But then I just randomly tried it on my severe back pain. Boom, it got better. So I'm really living in two different worlds here. One of them is I'm this geeky science guy trying to figure out why the heck is this where it's not supposed to work, right? Everything I learned tells me, this doesn't work. Cells don't respond to this. And yet I don't have any back pain anymore. And I went through a medical system that ejected me and labeled me very negatively. And all I was trying to do was manage pain, right? So I'm right there with everybody. It's like, and so when I'm selling stuff to people, I actually don't do the selling. It's my wife does this. My wife, right? And so I stay away from the selling of it pretty much. And I just mostly many people of those 6 emails I got this morning, I've gotten many more since then, but the 6 we had before our first talk, at least 2 of them were, give me an assurance. I'm a doctor, and before I can use this on patients, I need to have proof that it works. And my answer is always the same. The only reason I know this works is because I tried it. The only reason you're going to know it works is because you tried it. Mm-hmm. And then people say, well, how do I know PEMF works? And I'm like, well, look at the scientific literature. There's at least 1,000 papers, right? We've talked about this too. And, but yeah, it's very common to find copies of our stuff. In fact, I think right now, actively or recently, there are 6, I think at least 6 companies copying our technology and trying to sell it as something new. And they're copying something older, that we did before. But getting the trapezoid right so that it has to work repeatably on me, or I just don't even make it for anybody else, because it doesn't work for me. I mean, why would I want somebody else to pay money for it? So I've spent a lot of time making sure that it works really well. But the funny story is I can get that design exactly right, and then we send it to an assembly plant or something somewhere, and they'll send them to us. They don't work. and we'll say, well, what did you do? Oh, well, we saved a quarter of a penny here. We saved a half a penny here. We changed this component. And I said, I know a design's not supposed to be that sensitive, but it actually is. It actually makes a difference. So a lot of these people who've ripped off our stuff, like there's some people who do telltale stuff on. There's one guy who's got a whole Facebook channel based upon how outraged he is about how his previous employer stole our technology. He actually goes into a description of watching his employer work through a microscope, dissecting one of our devices, and then he respec'd it and used, different transistors and different components to make it better. And I'm like, good luck with that. I've tried many, many things. And of course it doesn't work as well. It sort of works. It's probably not a bad deal, but, and I don't mind competitors. In fact, just secretly between you and me and the, few people who are watching, I really hope someone does this better than me, because I would like to move on in my life. I'd love to be able to walk to CVS, pay a few bucks and buy one that works better than what I can make, because if that happens, boy, that's fine. I'm done with it.
Maybe what will be next is everybody who wants the special frequency, it'll be more like a Game Boy. You'll have cartridges with special frequencies. You go to CVS, you'll buy it, and you put it in your device, you turn it on, there you go.
Well, the other way to do it is if they get the basics correct on PEMF, then you can change the frequency all you want. And that's what, like the M1, you've been playing around with our model M1. There are different frequencies and different patterns, and those kind of work better or worse for some people. They're all sort of in the 100 hertz or below range. But some of them get up there like gamma wave. They get up the higher frequencies. They can be very irritating to your brain. If you use it on your head, you just got to stop. Don't do that. I don't childproof any of this stuff. It's low power, but you really got to be careful when you're using it. Just, pay attention to yourself. Don't just put it on and fall, go to sleep. But I would say the thing is, if you get the waveform correct, then you can try different patterns, and it's true. Different patterns work better for me, and different patterns don't work so well. And some people have told me, oh, Schumann works really, really well, but Omni 8 doesn't. And then they'll tell me, oh, Omni 8 works really, really well. It's actually better than the Schumann frequencies. But everybody kind of varies on that. But it's always by small amounts, 10, 15, 20%, layered on top of a system that basically works.
Yeah, and in my case, I've had my M1 almost a year. I literally turned on the Schumann one time, and I was like, it's kind of agitating to me. I haven't used it since. With Omni 8, I've used Omni 8. I used A9. A9 was what I had before. Gave that unit to my mom. And then when I had my M1 unit, I used the A9 protocol for a little while. And then I switched to the Omni 8. And I'd say, honestly, I've used Omni 8 5 pulses per second, like one that only does 5 pulses per second.
Right.
That only does 10 pulses per second. I've used the structured level one, which I'm going to talk about in a later talk with you. I've used that a little bit. And I think I used the rest one occasionally when I was sleeping on it, but with some of the stuff that I talked about in previous videos, which I'll talk about in other videos, with more direct interaction on the tissue, I don't feel the need to use it when I'm sleeping because I get better and faster results during the day.
Mm-hmm.
Or when it was doing the passive application of the device, it would take longer for areas to heal. And I think that's more related to what you said about exercise, the idea of kinetic motion. When I'm actually pressing into the tissue and forcing it to pay attention to the area that I'm stimulating, then it seems to respond better in healing than it does for just letting it sit there.
Well, yeah, I think some of these active uses that you've been experimenting with are very interesting, and trying them on myself, I think you're right.
Do we have time to keep talking? Do we need to break for folks, or do you have places to be?
Why don't we break here and we can continue on in virtual space almost instantaneously.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, we'll see you later in our next discussion.